Dr. Kevin Hall, whose groundbreaking research exposed the dangers of ultra-processed foods, shocked the scientific and medical communities this week by announcing his early retirement and blaming it on censorship from RFK Jr.'s administration.
That interview was denied. Our press release was also quashed for no reason given.
The HHS communications director edited those questions and attributed them to me.
It was going against the narrative that RFK Jr. was talking about.
Are we really listening to the science? Are we willing to actually listen to what the studies are showing, or are we only interested in purveying the preconceived narrative?
What is it going to be like if they want to start, actually meddling in the research itself?
Yeah. Some of the science was almost hidden from the public, right?
I sat down with Dr. Kevin Hall, world-leading metabolism and nutrition researcher. For over 2 decades, Kevin's studies have shattered myths and hype and regularly set both the media and the internet ablaze. His new book, Food Intelligence, goes over the science of nutrition and weight loss and how to separate fact from fiction and not be misled by social media diatribes. We talked about the epidemic of ultra-processed foods, what causes weight gain and weight loss, and the censorship he experienced under RFK Jr.'s administration. I remember watching you give a talk maybe 3-4 years ago, and you were saying that junk food, ultra-processed food, yeah, these foods seem to be involved, but we don't know why they're fattening. Maybe it's the microbiome, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And I remember being blown away that we don't know why. Like, to me, it's so surprising to hear. And I think you've made some progress, even though it's only been 3-4 years. I think now we have a better idea from your work of why these foods promote weight gain or fat gain.
Yeah. So I think it's one of those interesting things because as scientists we like to try to have a model of how the system works and therefore be able to make predictions about what the most important factors are. And going into designing the trial for ultra-processed foods, I think a lot of people had some really strong opinions about what the main drivers of excess calorie intake are. We've had this long-standing debate between whether or not it's highly processed carbs or even just carbs in general driving, insulin secretion, which might have, there's all sorts of downstream effects of excess insulin secretion. There's other folks, that it kind of has flip-flopped back and forth over the years. But, when I was first sort of, became aware of anything like body weight regulation when I was just like a kid, it was the low-fat craze, and it was high-fat diets that were causing excess calorie intake. And so what we tried to do is make sure that the diets were matched for carbs and fat so that we could maybe take that part out of the equation. Of course, you can't match everything. So, added sugars were higher in the ultra-processed diet arm of the study, but total sugars weren't. We made sure that total sugars were the same. So yeah, but the point is that even when you design a trial to kind of look at some specific aspect that you're targeting, just because you say that you're targeting that one thing doesn't mean that that's the thing that's driving it, right? So I think a lot of people came away from that study saying, oh, it's something about the method of processing the food that's driving this effect. And, that might be true. But we haven't isolated the method of processing. We got lots of different methods of processing going on, both in the minimally processed diet, washing the food as a method of processing, chopping it as processing, different cooking techniques or different ways of processing. And then there's the industrial processes, and there's a whole host of those that are involved in making ultra-processed foods. And so we weren't really isolating any individual aspect of processing, and so we didn't have a specific mechanism that we were targeting. We were just saying, let's take 2 diets or 2 food environments in this very artificial kind of environment of this inpatient feeding study, and let's make them as separate as we possibly can on the extent of the number of foods that we're presenting people that are from this so-called ultra-processed category, and then avoiding those entirely in the other group and making it almost entirely minimally processed foods. And let's see if we see anything. once we matched for, sugar and fat and salt and fiber and overall energy density of the diets, we matched for a bunch of things, but of course we're using real foods here and lots of other things are variable. So at the end of the day, when we saw this big effect, we couldn't really say what the mechanism was, because to know that, you would want to actually keep some parameter constant and then vary some other variable that you think is explanatory. And we hadn't done that yet. But again, one of the funny things was that so many folks, both regular folks who were fascinated by the study, as well as scientists who thought they saw in our study a reflection of maybe their pet theory or their kind of body of work in the past, right? So you had folks like Keys DeGraff or Kieran Ford look at the data and say, oh, it's all about texture and eating rate, right? The ultra processed foods are so much softer and they're eaten too quickly, and that's the reason why. You had other folks look at it and say, oh, well, it's the added sugars and the highly processed carbs that are driving this effect. Other folks look at it and say, well, yeah, the overall energy densities of the diets were matched, but the actual non-beverage, once you got rid of all the beverages from the diets, it turned out that the ultra processed foods had a higher energy density, despite the fact that they were matched for the macronutrients overall. So people saw very different explanations within that study, and most of them, I would say, were pretty darn convinced that their explanation was right. And I think a lot of folks got very frustrated with me because I would say, yeah, it's a perfectly viable hypothesis. We actually have to design a new study to test it by varying that parameter that you think is the most critical one, and maybe we can get at some of the answers that way. And so, yeah, you're right. That's one of the things that we had been doing until the study just wrapped up a couple of weeks ago, which is kind of nice. But it was ongoing when I left the NIH, a trial to kind of start to keep diets that are very high in ultra processed foods, but vary some of these properties and see if that has an effect on how much people choose to eat. And if we could understand those mechanisms, then we could start to isolate out, well, is it really something about the ultra processing? Or is it something else, that some property that generally brings along and was different in the first study that can potentially explain those results?
Mm-hmm. So for people at home, just to make sure that they can follow along, maybe we can start by explaining what ultra processed foods are compared to minimally processed, and maybe some examples, and then kind of give an idea of what the study tested. Starting with the big ultra processed food study, and then we can get into some more of the details of the result.
Yeah, sure. So, it's been kind of interesting to follow this along the years, because this concept of ultra processed foods really began in 2009, I believe, is when this concept was first formally introduced by Carlos Monteiro and his team in Brazil. And what he had noticed was that, he was very much nutrient focused, like many other folks in nutrition. And what he noticed was something very strange in the Brazilian population, which was that people were purchasing much less sugar than they used to purchase, and purchasing much less oil than they used to purchase. And both now you've got the carbs and the fat, and those are both going down in purchasing, and yet obesity rates were going up. And he had a very hard time understanding why that would be, until he realized that, well, they're no longer purchasing the sugar and the oil anymore, because it's already contained in the foods that they're buying. They're getting pre-prepared foods, essentially, which are part of the problem, is that fewer people are cooking. These more convenient and shelf-stable and accessible foods that are tasty and engineered in certain ways are becoming more and more prevalent in the Brazilian food supply. And that's when he had this idea, this sort of light bulb moment, that, maybe we have been missing, by looking at these nutrient-based analyses, missing, something much more important that was happening in the food system in Brazil, which was it was becoming increasingly industrialized. And I think that he decided, I'm going to devise a way of studying food in this way. And, folks had kind of talked about the concept of junk food before. And so some people criticize Carlos by saying, oh, you just kind of renamed junk food. But at the same time, I think that one of the common criticisms now is that not all ultra processed food really is junk food, right? So like there's lots of what, from a nutrient perspective, people might consider to be very healthy products that happen to be ultra processed because they contain some food technology and some additives or emulsifiers or something that allows them to be, a ready meal to be heated up in a microwave in 4 minutes and still, maintain its physical integrity or something like that. So anyway, so Carlos said, we're going to not even consider nutrients in the food. We'll just look at what he called the degree and extent of processing. I'll share with why I think it's not, why I still think there's a lot of confusion around this. So he has 4 categories now. It changed over the years from 3 to 4 categories, but the 4 categories are minimally processed foods. These are kind of the foods that you would get more or less, as you'd find them in nature. You're allowed to wash them, chop them up. You can kind of freeze them or can them without, adding too many preservatives or ferment them. Those are all still minimally processed foods. And a good example would be, corn on the cob, right? Or even chopping the corn kernels off of the cob and putting it in some water and maybe a little bit of salt or something like that. Still a minimally processed food. Then you get the so-called processed culinary ingredients. The way I like to think about these are things that typically people are not eating on their own, right? So sugar, salt, butter, corn oil would be another example of a processed culinary ingredient that might be used in cooking. Then you would combine them with category 1 foods to prepare a meal or to further modify the food for taste and so that combination of category 1 with processed culinary ingredients, category 2, creates what are called processed foods. So that's category 3. And again, you're using more or less traditional techniques and ingredients to prepare like most meals that you would make at home, then at the end of the day would be classified as processed food if you were selling them, for example, on the street or something like that. And then there's basically everything else. So it's kind of you could define it by exclusion. If you doesn't fit into one of those 3 categories, it would be called ultra processed food. But there is a very long definition that's varied over time, and it includes some aspects which I think a lot of people really object to in terms of Carlos talks about the purpose of processing is part of the definition, and that involves like those foods being marketed, being highly profitable, using cheap ingredients that are, readily available from commodity crops, things like that, but also looking at, using processes and ingredients that are just typically not available to people in their home kitchens or even restaurants. So thinking about processes like, extrusion cooking, where you basically are putting materials into what looks like it's a high pressure, it almost looks like a meat grinder, but think about that with temperatures and pressures, orders of magnitude higher. You're essentially cooking and extruding some raw materials through this system to create like a cheese puff or something like that, for example. That kind of technology is now common in the food industry and even common in relatively small food manufacturing practices, but it's not available to you in your home, your home kitchen. Most chefs are not doing extrusion cooking. But interestingly, because no manufacturer is required to say how they make their foods, like what are the actual processes by making the foods, practically what's happened is that people look to the formulation of the food as a marker of ultra processing. And so now what you have is looking at the ingredients list on a food, which is required in many countries to provide a more or less complete ingredient list of what's in the food in order of their relative proportion in the product. And many of those things will again be things that are not used in home kitchens, right, or by chefs in preparation. And so that's one of the markers of ultra processing is these kinds of ingredients that are used in industrial manufacturing, these kind of emulsifiers and artificial sweeteners and other aspects that will help kind of with the food technology as it's being prepared. And so as a result of that, there's in this category of foods, and because many countries have relied on many of these really wonderful advances in food science and technology, a huge swath of the food supply in North America, the UK, Canada, Australia now qualifies as ultra processed foods. And I think one of the criticisms that people have is, well, number one, it's still a little bit of a squishy definition. This NOVA categorization system, it still relies on a little bit of subjective interpretation of some of these things. They object to the fact that one product, because it contains one added preservative versus another product that doesn't, but it's more or less the same food, that crosses the threshold, and that's somehow off-putting to people. But you got to draw the line somewhere, so you're always going to have edge cases like that. And the third thing that's problematic is it doesn't say anything about the mechanism, right? There's all sorts of things going on when you make a food in an industrial way that ends up being ultra processed. One of the things that we found in our case was, even though we weren't trying to make the energy density of the actual foods different, and from a nutrient perspective, you often think of higher fat foods as being more energy dense because it contains more fat, contains more calories per gram than carbs and protein. In this case, ultra processed foods ended up being more energy dense, not because they differed in macronutrients, but because processing a food on purpose is trying to dry them out so that they have longer shelf life, and they have the sort of textural properties that people are interested in. And so you're manipulating in the processing and in the manufacture of the food some of the very variables that are potentially mechanistically underlying why people consume more of those foods than other foods. And of course, you don't know when you can't just take across the board and you're just trying to match for nutrients like we did in our first study and say, okay, well, we're going to look at a highly ultra processed diet that's matched for all these different nutrients of concern to a minimally processed diet. There's going to be tons of things that are variable between those two things. That's one of the central problems in nutrition research, is you've always got things that are unmatched. Unless you have a 30-arm study, you're never going to be able to one by one kind of vary each and every one of those variables.
Yeah, I was thinking of there used to be a definition of ultra processed food, or at least something that was colloquial, which was something that has had something artificially added or removed. So it's missing a natural ingredient or has an artificial ingredient added to it. But it sounds like that's too simple. It doesn't quite cover it.
Right. It doesn't quite cover it. And I would even argue that the NOVA classification of ultra processed foods isn't even limited to the foods themselves. It's also limited to, again, the purpose by which you're making the foods. And so that can incorporate things like, are they heavily marketed? Are they targeted towards certain segments of the population? These very broad sort of social things that we like to think of kind of beyond the foods themselves. And our studies so far had not been really testing that. We've been testing the foods themselves, but it was clear even when we asked our chefs, how much more time does it take you to make the minimally processed diet compared to the ultra processed diet? They're like, it's like an order of magnitude longer to kind of prepare the minimally processed diet. And then we looked at the kind of cost of the ingredients. It was like 40% more expensive to prepare the minimally processed diet. And so these other factors are, I think, annoyingly still part of this NOVA classification system. And it's annoying because for folks like me who are a little bit more reductionist in nature, we're like, yeah, those things can be important, but don't make it as part of the definition of the food itself, right? It's just like, this is so annoying. I can study those other behavioral psychology aspects and these broader issues of the food environment separately. Let's not make it about the food. So I'm constantly annoyed with the definition, and yet I'm also annoyed with some of the criticisms of the definition that I often hear. And yeah, so it's an interesting space to be in for sure.
I mean, it's hard to define exactly what an ultra-processed food is, but Twinkies, everybody understands. Soda, everybody understands that's going to be ultra-processed. And then an apple, steak, everybody understands that's going to be unprocessed or minimally processed. So for a lot of foods, it's clear. There might be some gray area there for oils, for refined oils. People sometimes call that ultra-processed, and I've seen that in the classification, it's actually in this Class 2 or Category 2.
Yeah. culinary ingredients. Yes, processed
Right.
culinary ingredients. Yeah, exactly. So there's the clear cases, and then I think one of the biggest arguments against the NOVA classification system is that it's extremely broad,
Yeah.
right? And I think that it's also a bit of a misnomer, right? Because the way that we're really identifying these foods is more about their formulation as opposed to their method of processing. And I think that's again because people don't have access to information about how each food is processed, but we do have access to the ingredients. And so it ends up being more about looking at the ingredients list and trying to understand how these different ingredients are used and whether or not those are, typical culinary ingredients, or are they more in line with industrial manufacture. And then there's the separate question, which I think is, again, I would say part of the original sin of the NOVA classification system was that it's not necessarily in the definition, but if you read the papers, it's pretty clear that the authors and the inventors considered ultra-processed foods to be really bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
That the idea of a healthy ultra-processed food, it was like an oxymoron. And one of the things I'm trying to get at, and we write about in the book, is that we actually have to start seriously thinking about what do healthy ultra-processed foods look like, and be able to target by understanding the mechanisms by which unhealthy ultra-processed foods work, being able to say, yeah, we're never going to make a healthy Twinkie, right? Like there are going to be treats and things that you should probably try to minimize your inclusion of your diet, but there are things that we can use food technology and ultra processing to make healthier alternatives available to a wider group of people that are convenient and still affordable, and maybe even heavily marketed if we put in the right policies and the right incentives in place. And so even though it's not part of the definition, a lot of people think that the definition of ultra-processed foods must also mean it's necessarily bad for you. That's an empirical question, right? And there is now a lot of empirical data to suggest that diets high in ultra-processed foods are in fact bad for you. But some of the more careful epidemiological studies have really tried to narrow in, well, what categories or subcategories of ultra-processed foods are really driving most of the effects? What are the mechanisms? That's kind of the trials that we were trying to conduct to narrow in on those types of things. But again, we don't have all the answers yet. And so I think we do need some more research, but there's a lot that we can already do based on I think that the other part that, might have been a little bit unfortunate about the introduction of the NOVA categorization system was perhaps the implication that, yeah, you can just ignore everything that you learned about nutrition before, that nutrients aren't really important. We shouldn't be focusing on, added sugars and saturated fat and sodium. It's more about the extent and purpose of processing. Well, that's not how science works, right? You don't generally throw out decades and decades of knowledge that's been hard won in randomized controlled trials and mechanistic studies and epidemiological studies just because you have some new paradigm of looking at foods. They should, in some sense, be complementary. And that's one of the things I've argued in the past, is that the thing I like about the NOVA categorization system is that it says almost nothing about the nutrients. And in some ways, it's like a different lens. It's a different way of looking at our food that we didn't have before. And that has provided some valuable insights. But it doesn't mean that the nutrient lens is also, is just to be discarded. It's just a different sort of lens. And that's a point that the authors, I was an author until I had to remove myself of the new American Heart Association advisory on ultra-processed foods. That's one that we were trying to make quite strongly, was that, you still have, until we work out with some of the mechanisms that might be unique to ultra-processed foods, we still have all of this bed of knowledge about what a healthy diet looks like. And if an ultra-processed food happens to have all of those healthy attributes as well, then you should probably feel okay about eating that. And if it doesn't have any of the healthy attributes and is ultra-processed, then yeah, it's probably a good idea to avoid that as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, gets into this really interesting debate, which is how do we fix the problem? We have this abundance of ultra-processed foods. The last statistics I saw were the average American, I think, is 60% or something like that of their calories come from ultra-processed foods. It might be more now. And so clearly this is thought to be behind the obesity epidemic, the diabetes epidemic. And so there are these two basic camps that I've seen, and there are the purists who say, no, we just need to get rid of all of this junk and just get people to eat a healthy, unprocessed diet, Mediterranean diet or something like that, and just find ways to get people to do that. And then there's another camp that I think argues that that's unrealistic for a lot of people, that these foods are so ingrained and so palatable and so cheap and such a part now of the culture that it's just unrealistic, that we're not going to browbeat people into doing it. And I don't know how you incentivize. And so another proposal is, no, let's just try to make these foods healthier. Let's try to re-engineer ultra processed foods so that people can still buy them, but they're going to be better for them. What are your thoughts on that? I know you've touched on that a little bit, but in terms of, is that realistic? Can we make an impact that way? And could that happen in the real world?
Yeah, so I think it depends on which part of the world you're living in, right? So I think that, again, from the many places in the world that haven't already had their food supply overrun with, 60% of their calories from ultra processed foods, places like Latin America where it's, more like 25 to 30%, or other places around the world where it's a relatively low number, then yeah, maybe it is perfectly feasible to resist this and put in all the policies in place to kind of, yeah, let's not worry about the details of which might be healthy ultra processed foods, and we'll put in place policies to kind of potentially inhibit the growth of that segment of the food supply, and tax them and label them and all sorts of other things. That I think is a reasonable strategy. In countries like the US, where such a huge amount of ultra processed foods are already in the food supply and many people rely on them, first of all, for the folks who really are very interested and motivated and have the wherewithal and, to be honest, the privilege to be able to kind of prepare meals from scratch, they enjoy cooking, they have the skills and the time to do that. Would I say that they shouldn't avoid ultra processed food? No, go for it. You'll probably create a healthier diet if you avoid ultra processed foods. For the vast majority of us, that's not the situation that we find ourselves in, right? Even the privileged like myself, I still have a diet that still has quite a bit of ultra processed foods in it, but it's the types of foods within that category that I choose. I try to choose them. I try to choose the ones that make it more convenient for me to eat that healthier diet. So if it means pre-made sauce that has some preservatives in it to keep the shelf life high, but I know it makes it easier for me to make a tasty, plant-rich menu with lots of whole grains, then I would say that's a good ultra processed food, because otherwise it wouldn't be so tasty and I wouldn't make it as often. It would be more of a pain if I tried to make the sauce from scratch. I probably wouldn't do it. So there are ways to incorporate that into your life. The other issue is that if we were to just eliminate all ultra processed foods, like if I had a magic wand and said, okay, we know what a healthy diet looks like, and at the entire population level of the US, we're just going to eliminate ultra processed foods. Well, we don't grow enough what the USDA calls specialty crops to feed Americans enough fruits and vegetables and those kinds of things to actually provide the nutrient needs of the population. So we have the food system that we find ourselves in the rise of ultra processed foods can't be decoupled from the fact that the commodity crops that we know how to grow at high yields and produce so many more calories than we were able to do before the Green Revolution, those are not eaten directly by humans. They're either processed through animal feed to animals that we actually end up eating, or they're the raw inputs to ultra processed foods. And until we change the agricultural system in a way that is still not going to induce mass starvation, like people who have experimented with this in the past when they try to change the industrial agricultural system, like in Sri Lanka, like we talk about in the book, or what happened in Cuba after many of the farm supports were eliminated from the former Soviet Union. There's this period where people end up starving, right? Because they don't have the food in the food supply, and inflation just makes food out of reach for most folks. So it's a tough question, right, of what to do about this. And that's why I think that it's really important to think, past this current epidemic that we find ourselves in with diet-related chronic disease, of which ultra-processed foods, the unhealthy ones, are likely to be the main culprit, although it's not, a nail in the coffin of other proposed theories about how this has taken place. But we have to look past this to the fact that for the first time in human history, we kind of know where the population of humanity will kind of plateau. We don't have to worry about the Malthusian problem of keeping, can we produce enough calories and protein to feed the population because it's growing exponentially? Well, it's not exponential anymore. It's starting to tip that sort of inflection point towards a plateau. And for the first time in human history, we can say that's where we need to aim. We need to produce enough protein and calories and healthful foods to feed that population in an equitable way without destroying the planet in the process. And we argue in our book that a good chunk of that is likely to be ultra-processed foods. And so we better understand the properties by which ultra-processed foods have caused many of the problems that we've found ourselves in with this, rise in diet-related chronic disease, so that we can address that at the same time we're addressing the overall food system to feed everybody a healthful diet that is good for both people and the planet.
Yeah, you touched there on this contrast between some ultra-processed foods are really harmful and some not so much. I think this is something that I've seen 2 or 3 of these studies, and I was really surprised by these results. And I think these haven't really been communicated to the public that much. I think most of my viewers even might be unfamiliar with this. So maybe we can touch on this. Some of these, there's one, I think, in the Lancet, or one of the subjournals of the Lancet from maybe a couple of years ago. So yeah, on the types of ultra-processed foods, some are, like we said, some are clearly harmful, or at least these are all epidemiological. It's all observational solution. Caveat. So some are associated with more disease and death. Some they're like a neutral association, and some are either associated with benefit or sometimes borderline, but leaning towards. Yep. What are some of the examples there, or some of the outliers?
Yeah. So the ones that are pretty consistently associated with negative health outcomes are sugar sweetened beverages and processed meat products. Those two tend to be usually near the top of the list of drivers of many of the diet-related chronic diseases that we've seen. And then subcategories of ultra-processed foods that tend to be high in saturated fat, sodium, and processed carbs or sugar, are kind of part of those list of categories as well. And so again, it's not, it's maybe a little bit too simplistic at this point, but it seems like if we could avoid many of those foods, and many of those same foods would have been identified by other ways of looking at diets, right? I mean, other kind of ways of analyzing problematic nutrients in those foods would have also probably picked out many of those same products as being potentially harmful. And so I think an open question right now is still, are those subcategories of ultra-processed foods really driving all of the effect? That's, I think, still an important question, which, again, you could have strong opinions about that, but we don't have good data, right? And there's lots of people with strong opinions. There's not a lot of people with good data on this. And that's a really hard, it's not a trial that you can run, because now we're talking about hard outcomes, right? Now, can you look at some surrogate markers in a trial that might give rise to some reasonable hypotheses to extrapolate to these longer term things? Yeah, possibly. I think that's possible that you could design such a study, but I don't think we're there yet. But it's tempting, right? It's really tempting to look at these subcategories and be able to say, yeah, those are the real bad guys. Everything else is probably fine. And even if it makes you overeat a little bit, maybe we can address that by some other kind of tweaks to the diet. But yeah, so it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I think those examples of the soda, I think you'll find little resistance to the idea that the soda isn't great for health, and even the processed meats, like things like bacon or beef jerky. I think many people would not be super surprised by that. But some of the things that they find kind of right on the null line, I'm looking at the Lancet paper here. Sweets and desserts is right
Yeah.
on the null, which is kind of, I was like, what? How can that be? Like that's usually it's going to have a lot of refined added sugars.
Hmm.
And then ultra processed breads and cereals is actually strongly trending towards a benefit. It's right on the borderline.
Yeah.
But so do you think these are reflect causality or it's just completely up in the air? What do you think is going on?
I mean, like I said, I think it's intriguing. I think it's definitely worth studying. And yeah, I'm also surprised by, these like confectionery products that seem to not have much effect. Um, and one of the things that was really surprising in our first study on ultra processed foods was I thought, given the dialogue around increased snacking being driving much of the obesity epidemic, um, our snack products were not eaten differentially more on the ultra processed diet than the minimally processed diet, despite them being very much the kinds of prototypical snack products that you would find. People did not eat more calories of like goldfish crackers or peanut butter crackers and some of the sweeter treats that we had compared to the nuts and dried fruit and things like that we had on the minimally processed snacks. So it was like, oh, that was I was surprised by that, right? So and again, it's one of those things where until you see the data, it's very easy to be surprised, and that's why we need to kind of design more careful experiments to get at some of these questions. But yeah, so does that mean that the sweets and the treats and the snacks that we often think of as driving much of the problem are innocent? I don't know. I mean, it's too early to say, I think, but from what little we know from the nutrient perspective, you would imagine that those are probably not that great for you and should be considered. Yeah, those are treats. Those are not supposed to form the basis of your diet. And yet, when you looked at other things about what contributes the most calories to, Americans, I think it is like those sweet confectionery treats that are kind of right up there. I think pizza is a big player as well, but they do form a pretty large component of the American diet, which is, so from that perspective, it seems like they should be associated. But maybe what this is picking out is that there's not a lot of variation in that one. Maybe people are eating so many of these darn things that on average, you're not able to get enough contrast in that aspect of people's at least what they're self-reporting in many of these epidemiological studies. I don't know. It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I definitely am skeptical or cautious. I definitely wouldn't, based on these two or three
Yeah.
epidemiological studies that I've seen, I wouldn't start eating.
Yeah, sure. It's all good, right?
Oh, not just because they don't say an association there. But I think
Swap out your beef jerky for like a Twinkie and you'll be
right,
fine.
right, right. Uh, but I think it's clearly is kind of shining a light on the uncertainty that we have with these foods that we call them all ultra processed foods, and we tend to think I even said that earlier. To me, I almost associate with junk food
Right.
automatically. But it's true that we have so little kind of granularity in our understanding. And so I think, yeah, the work that you did is part of the path there. So maybe we can go back
Sure.
to your study and a little bit of the what you guys actually tested and kind of what you found.
Hmm. Sure. So in that first study, yeah, what we were trying to do was design these two kind of very artificial food environments. And because we're interested in obesity and because we think that calorie intake is causally related to weight gain and weight loss, we decided we needed to do a study where we could actually accurately measure calorie intake. And unfortunately, uh, outside of keeping people in a research laboratory where you actually measure what they're actually eating, it's very difficult to measure calorie intake. It's one of those things that we've known for a long time in these like epidemiological studies where people are self-reporting. They might be pretty good at ranking each other in terms of who eats more vegetables than another person. But when it comes to assessing how many total calories people are eating, everybody recognizes it's an underestimate. And the sensitivity to detect differences between people with those kinds of measures and calorie intake is quite limited. There are methods like doubly labeled water and repeated body composition assessment where you can kind of back calculate how many calories people were eating, but those are pretty imprecise tools. And if you're changing macronutrients, you've got to make a whole bunch of assumptions. And so you can't really design a study that's relatively manageable in size using those techniques. So we opted for, well, we're just going to have to bring people in. And many folks have done studies measuring calorie intake of one meal, two meals over the course of a day or something like that, maybe a few days. But we were interested in keeping people for a little bit longer just because we're skeptical that maybe people are going to try to rig the system by, oh, they want me to eat this much more of this kind of food versus another. It's like, yeah, you could do that for a couple of days, but you're not going to do it for a week, right? So we kept people for an entire month at the NIH Clinical Center, where they're basically on the metabolic ward there. And we presented them with double the number of calories that we estimated would be required for maintaining their weight. And just gave them really simple instructions. Eat as much or as little as you'd like. We're going to be measuring lots of stuff. You're going to go in our respiratory chambers. We're going to measure energy expenditure. We're going to measure body composition. We're going to take your blood various times. And you shouldn't be trying to gain weight or lose weight. And what they didn't know is that we were measuring all their leftovers. So everything that was put on their plate was measured to 1/10 of a gram, and that the leftovers were brought down to the basement. And I don't envy this job, but people would go through item by item and try to figure out, what was the weight of the leftovers. And then by difference, we could calculate exactly what people ate. And we exposed them to basically two different food environments. One was very high in ultra-processed foods, according to the NOVA classification, 80% of a little more than 80% of calories from ultra-processed foods. And then another food environment that had 0% of calories from ultra-processed foods and about 80% from minimally processed foods. And the overall diets were matched for things like the overall energy density, the carbs, the fat, the sugar, pretty close to protein, although there was some comments about the protein, how well that was matched in the first study. Sodium was matched, fiber was matched, although not the type of fiber, and overall glycemic load was matched between the two diets. And basically, we were just trying to see, is there something about these kinds of foods that are primarily belonging in the ultra-processed food category, despite the fact that they're nutritionally, from those nutrient perspectives, equivalent to what we presented them in this minimally processed food environment, knowing full well that they vary in a lot of other things. Because this was the first randomized trial of this idea. And so what we ended up finding was that when people were exposed to the highly ultra-processed food environment, they ate about 500 calories per day on average more than the same people when they were exposed to the minimally processed food environment. They spontaneously gained weight and gained body fat. They were blinded to their weights. We measured them with their backs to the scales. They're wearing loose-fitting scrubs so they can't, or pajamas, so they can't tell if their clothes are getting tighter or looser. And when they were on the minimally processed diet, they're losing weight and losing body fat. And they're reporting the same degree of like hunger and fullness and satisfaction and eating capacity over the course of the day. And so we were left with this observation that for whatever was varying between these two diets, something had caused them to eat far too many calories in one diet compared to another. We tried to make sure that the foods were equally familiar by giving at the screening a battery of do you recognize these foods? Have you tried them before? Or do you have a strong dislike for them? So we wanted to eliminate the sort of neophobia of I've never seen, this kind of food before. I'm obviously not going to touch it. And the chefs were trying to make all the meals quite pleasant for people because we didn't want people to drop out of the study. And in fact, people did report the meals being equally pleasant. It's because I've heard a lot of people criticize the study as like, oh, of course people like burgers and fries more than, salmon and green beans. I'm like, I don't know, I kind of like salmon and green beans more than burgers and fries, but maybe I'm weird. So it was really kind of interesting to do this trial. It was the first trial that I've done with ad libitum calorie intake being the primary outcome. And like I said, this is really at this point the only viable way of doing those kinds of studies with that outcome. If you have other outcomes like weight change or something like that, that's different. But if you're interested in understanding what drives changes in calorie intake, there really isn't a substitute for kind of domiciling people and measuring this directly like we did.
Just to clarify for people at home, in case they're probably most listeners are not familiar with these trials that you run, and they're very unique. The metabolic word trials, these people are living in the facility the entire month they can't leave, they cannot walk out, they can't bring any food with them, they can't go to the vending machine, every bite they have during the month is provided by you, and then every morsel they don't eat is weighed again. So they're not living at home. They're completely
Right.
they're arrested at the institute for a month, right?
Yeah, they to be clear, they can go outside with one of the study staff with them, right? So they can't just go out. They can't go for a run. They can't like stop by the cafeteria or grab a Starbucks or anything like that. So yeah, so they do get a chance to get a little bit outside. It is an entire month. It would be cruel and unusual to not allow that. But yeah, it's
walk outside, but accompanied by
a staff member. Yeah,
sure,
exactly.
they're not cheating. Yeah,
exactly. Because that's one of the things that we know, unfortunately, in studies that have gone to the expense of using that doubly labeled water method. Even when you provide people with all the food on an outpatient basis, even when they're eating like maybe 1 or 2 meals in front of the research staff and they pack out the rest to go, we know that they are eating on average like 400 calories per day off study food, at least 400 calories a day off study food, because you don't even know that they ate the food that you gave them to pack out.
right.
So it's like, it's even those really highly controlled studies that say that they're providing all the food to people, and therefore, and having maybe some metric of adherence that's like I don't know, a way back or something like that occasionally. It just turns out that people are people, right? And food is a very social part of their lives. And if you allow them to kind of go back and try to go back to their regular life, even with simple instructions, it turns out that they're not really good at that. And we thought of ways of how could we fix that? Could we maybe make people videotape every meal that they're eating, so at least we could be sure that they ate what we gave them. Maybe they eat over and above the study amount, but yeah, that becomes extremely burdensome to people if you want to do it for more than like a few meals. So
Right.
yeah, it's a real challenge.
Very voyeuristic to have the research watch every single meal. And you can still eat outside of meals if you want. You can record the in-trial meal,
Yeah,
go eat whatever you want on the side.
exactly. Right.
But this gets into this idea of these trade-offs, because with your setup, of course, you have the utmost control, but then you lose the real world
Yes.
relevance, and then there's this problem of scale. So people will often ask, well, why are these trials only a month, or sometimes they're not even that long. Sometimes they're a week, or
Right.
so why can't we just do a metabolic war trial for a year or 5 years, or explain the real world limitations?
Yeah, I mean, what people I think don't realize, especially when they see a relatively small study size, is they think, oh, well, all these people did this at once, right? And it's like, no, because we only have a very small number of beds, and it's so labor intensive to kind of prepare all these meals. The kitchen is, you might think it's like this huge facility to prepare all this food, but it's not. It's pretty modest size. Well, by a home kitchen, it's large, but it's a pretty modest sized kitchen with a modest staff to do these kinds of things. And so, for example, in our trial that just wrapped up recently, we could have a maximum of 2 people at a time. And so they're staying for a month each, and with only 2 people at a time, you can see how the duration of the study can really climb. So it took us almost 3 years from the first participant to the last participant for 36 people, especially when you count for holidays like, the American Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's period. You generally don't have a lot of volunteers over that time frame. So yes, and then there's the other aspect, which is when it comes to study size, it's not just a matter of cramming in more people, but it's actually unethical to study more people than is needed to answer the question you're posing, right? So before you do any of these studies, you do something called a statistical power calculation, where you say, this is the outcome I'm interested in, and you pre-specify what that is, and you say, either based on previous data or something else, that this is the effect size that I'm interested in. In this case, how many differences in calories per day would I consider a meaningful difference that I'm trying to design a study to detect? And you know something about the variability in your measurement as well as the variability between people. And you say, well, I have 80% chance of arriving at a minimum effect size of that amount if I was to study 20 people. Or if it turns out that that number is 200 people, then you're like, yeah, I can't do that study. It's just not going to happen in a reasonable time frame. And so you have to pre-specify all this ahead of time and saying, how do I match the practicalities of actually running the study with the study size that I think is a meaningful thing, with the effect size that I think is meaningful. And at the end of the day, there is no perfect study. So you're always doing these trade-offs. And we were kind of focusing on what could we practically answer in a relatively short time frame. But the frustrating thing is that, and don't get me wrong, I'm thrilled that we had the access to the facilities that we had, because those over years had been diminishing in the number of facilities like that around the country, because the NIH defunded their clinical research center program in 2016. And so the number of places around the country that could do these inpatient metabolic ward studies fell quite dramatically. But for most of our studies, there was no need for them to be in a hospital ward, right? These people were not, acutely ill. And we weren't giving them like some sort of experimental drug or something like that. We were just feeding them real food and trying to measure these behaviors. And so for a long period of time, I was trying to get folks at the NIH interested in, could we just rent like a retreat facility in some rural part of Virginia, which doesn't have access to like McDonald's and things like that, and had a big kitchen because they provide food for events, and just house some folks out there, like not 2 at a time, but like 30 at a time, and answer the kinds of questions that we were taking 3 years to do in a few months. And we were kind of on the way to try to get to do those kinds of studies, but there's a lot of inertia. It's never been done before, and there's always regulatory oversight that has to take place. And but we were in the process of trying to get some studies like that off the ground, because I think that we can, what we need to kind of unravel some of these mechanistic questions is the ability to kind of go through these hypotheses one after another and design the right study to test these different mechanisms. And right now we just don't have the facilities to do that. We're stuck either with these relatively uncontrolled trials where we don't have the difference in food intake that we want to have to kind of investigate the mechanisms we're interested in, or we have these really highly controlled trials that we can only really study a very small number of people at a time, and it takes us forever to get forever. For me, I'm an impatient person, right? If I decide to study, I want to answer that question as quickly as possible. And so waiting 3 years from the time that you ask the question, I think of this in terms of my kids, right? I have like relatively young children. If every time they ask me a question, I'm like, yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, get back to me in a few years. I'll answer it for you. Their frustration level would go through the roof. And that's kind of how we feel sometimes as scientists, waiting for the answers to the questions we posed years prior.
Yeah, I didn't even know that it was so small that you had 2 slots and then you had to run that, whatever, like 10, 15 times the month length.
Exactly.
I thought it was you had the size to do it all at once. I didn't even realize it was that.
Yeah, no, I wish. I mean, we would have been able to easily kind of address a wider scope of questions and be able to kind of, because the other thing that people always ask me about is, oh, well, is there a sex effect? I'm like, well, we didn't really have enough people to kind of bucket into the different sexes, different BMI categories, diabetes versus no diabetes, the kind of sizes of the studies that you need to have to test those kinds of contrasts are quite a bit larger. We did do a study that was kind of like that, where we had everybody at once. It was that Biggest Loser study that we did, where basically everyone was participating in this reality TV program all at once. We didn't have to house everybody at the time. So that was how that's in fact one of the motivations for me to think about, well, how could we do something more, not as crazy as the Biggest Loser study, but more controlled and more ethical, and actually get some answers much more quickly. Because my motivation for doing the Biggest Loser study was because I had a postdoc who started one of our first controlled feeding trials, and I realized he's not going to get any papers out of this, because it's going to take forever to get through the study. We got to find another project for him so that he gets some results and can publish some papers. And that was the reason we did the Biggest Loser study to begin with, was it just me feeling like a bad mentor for roping in this poor postdoc who was it was taking forever to kind of run through this, one or two people at a time, through the metabolic ward.
Maybe you need to go the other direction. You figure out the study you want to do, and then you call the TV station to turn it into
Right.
a show, right? And then every week one gets eliminated.
Yeah.
You show out of it.
That would be fun.
The other thing that popped out, that actually I was really surprised when I read the study, and you already alluded to this, is the fact that the ultra processed foods and the minimally processed groups, they rated the foods as similarly pleasurable. Is that how you worded it?
Yeah, it was pleasant. So we basically had people taste various meals, take the first bite, rate its pleasantness. And we didn't do it multiple times over the course of the meal, because people have their sort of sensory specific satiety, and the pleasantness will change over time. But just kind of rate the foods like you would at a restaurant, right? Once you take your first bite, you usually have a pretty good idea if you like it or not, right? And so that's kind of what we were doing. And because again, it would have been a very obvious sort of explanation. It's like, oh yeah, well, people just hated the minimally processed foods,
Right.
and they liked the ultra processed foods. And if that had been the result, that would have been the result. But that's not what we found, right? So either people are lying, or you have to take the data at face value. I don't know why they would lie. They didn't. But yeah. Anyway, that's what we found.
Yeah, it seems very counterintuitive, because our idea of why these ultra processed foods are so appetitive. I mean, some people will call them addictive, but that gets into a whole other debate. But it's like you can't resist it because it tastes so good, because it's so stimulating. But to find that, and as opposed to chicken and broccoli and rice and all these things that people think of as, okay, I gotta eat it because it's healthy, but I'd rather eat the
Right.
cheese and the Coca-Cola. And so to find out that they rated it equally pleasant it was very surprising to me.
Yeah, it was surprising. I mean, I don't know if I would say it was surprising. It was encouraging to me, I would say, because it means that you don't, and people have used this counterexample before, right? Like the food when you go on vacation and you're choosing like higher quality meals, and it's typically minimally processed food, it's not that you find the food any less tasty. You find it very tasty, right? So it's not really about the tastiness of the food.
Mhm.
This kind of gets at some of the neuroscience of the distinction between liking and wanting, right? So this is Kent Berridge's idea, and the different neural mechanisms that are involved in deciding whether or not you like something. Usually there's a good overlap between what you like and what you want, but those things can become dissociated from each other, and there are actually different neurobiological processes going on. And some of the folks in doing the systems neuroscience of appetite regulation have also seen this, even in kind of rodent models. You don't need to taste food to learn about its nutrient value to you. And so you can do these studies where you get like two tasteless or tasteless solutions, and you kind of infuse glucose or saline into the stomach of an animal, and it will learn which thing is paired with the sucrose versus sucralose or some other sweetener that or saline that's being put into the animal's gut. There is a nutrient sensing pathway that is making these flavor nutrient kind of comparisons when you taste it and when you actually detect those nutrients in the digestion and absorption of calories. So, and these are different roads. So that's something that Dana Small and Ivan de Roggio have called like the high road versus the low road. The high road being the taste and the sensory perception, the tastiness, the pleasantness of a meal, and the low road being the kind of gut brain sort of nutrient matching aspect. And so, and post-ingestive as opposed to the tasting part of the food. So, and we've learned a lot about how much of our food intake behavior is driven more by the low road than the high road. So more about wanting rather than liking. And so in that sense, it wasn't that surprising. And it suggests that from a conscious perception of pleasure, you might be able to engineer foods that don't drive excess wanting, but still arrive at the same amount of pleasure in terms of, oh yeah, that was perfectly tasty. And yeah, I would rate the pleasantness of that meal equal to another, but some other aspect might be driving these kind of longer term effects in the hours after meals that can impact satiety.
Right. Yeah, that's I think the question that pops up is if it's not the pleasantness or the flavor, what is driving then this prevalence of ultra-processed foods and how difficult it is to get people to eat unprocessed foods or minimally processed? Maybe it's some other aspect. Maybe it's just that they're cheaper or that they're easier, like less time involved in cooking. Or maybe it's that you guys had these chefs preparing really nice
Right.
meals, whereas somebody at home might not make them as tasty. But yeah, what do you think is driving this epidemic of ultra-processed foods, if not the flavor?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what our study was getting at was that there seems to be something about the foods themselves that goes beyond like the conscious perception of pleasure of eating the foods that is driving it. But there are many, many other aspects of these foods that have made them so popular and so successful in the marketplace. One is that they require relatively cheap inputs to make these sort of commodity crops that are not readily eaten by humans, and we've come up with all sorts of incredible ways of re-engineering them. Like instead of using cane sugar, we can make high fructose corn syrup out of the corn that's much more cheaply produced and at higher yield. And then as a result, they're more affordable. They can be more heavily marketed by the food manufacturers, and they're undergoing constant reformulation as well, which is, I think, part of this. There's like almost an evolution and selection of the fittest that goes on when you have that ability to kind of engineer foods in this way, right? Because you can just you do your product testing and you can kind of get a good idea of what it looks like in your focus group, and then you launch it in the marketplace, and then many things fail, and then you say, okay, well, what can I learn about why it failed? And I can re-engineer it, introduce another product like that. Or you look to see what your competitor did and why their product failed. And you might make a copycat that doesn't have the property that made it fail. And so what you see is like this rapid evolution in the marketplace of not necessarily even consciously knowing how the sales are being generated in terms of mechanistically of changing people's appetite from a biological standpoint, but changes in formulation that make the product successful. And at what price point you can put it in, where in the supermarket you need to place the product, and how is it different from competitors. And there's all of these other aspects which are involved, but I do think it is something about the foods themselves, and not intentionally in the sense that obviously food manufacturers want to drive sales. They're also tapping into this by successive re-engineering and putting those foods out in the marketplace, seeing some fail, seeing some succeed, and learning along the way. That's their job, right? So, yeah.
The fact that people end up eating more of these foods is that, as you were saying that, I was like almost having an epiphany. Yeah, that's almost by design, right? They're designed to do that, isn't that? Aren't they kind of shooting for craveability and getting people to keep going back for more? So that's kind of how these foods come about.
Yeah, that's right. And and people have argued to me that that necessarily means that they overconsume calories, but that's not necessarily true either, right? I mean, Coca-Cola is just as happy to sell you Diet Coke
Right.
as it is regular Coke, right? So, and of course, there's this big debate about artificial sweeteners and whether they really end up driving people to overconsume calories. But at least the data that I've seen that have looked at trials comparing, regular sugar sweetened beverages versus artificially sweetened beverages, when it comes to calories, there's not really much comparison, right? It's clear that the sugar sweetened beverages contribute more to calories than diet beverages. Doesn't mean that there might be other deleterious effects of diet beverages on other aspects of health, but yeah. So I think that the question is, how can we help sort of align the incentives of, yes, food manufacturers should be able to make a profit. They should be able to make a healthy profit. But how do you realign the incentives in such a way and policies in such a way to kind of drive the production of healthy ultra-processed foods? How do we make convenient, affordable options actually healthy options for people? And so we have a chapter in our book with a whole suite of ideas of not just being the labels and taxation, although those things play a role, but how can we, put incentives in place at, the level of supermarkets in terms of, tax breaks for if you were to monitor the average healthfulness of a grocery cart, because people have monitored that. It's actually pretty poor in the US. The healthy eating index of an average grocery cart is like pretty bad. But if the supermarket got tax incentives based on how healthy the average purchase was, that would put some upwards pressure on manufacturers to create healthier products.
Right.
If you eliminated, I think a lot of people don't know that research and development and marketing of products, ultra-processed foods you get to write off those expenses in your taxes if you're a manufacturer. Well, maybe you could make it so that if they don't meet the FDA definition of healthy, you can't have that tax write-off. So that would encourage manufacturers to kind of make the products that might still be ultra processed, but meet the FDA definition of healthy, which is right now a voluntary label that is due to go into effect in the next couple of years. So there's all sorts of ways that you can incentivize, not just taxing and removing foods from the marketplace, which is, I think, where a lot of the policy discussion is right now, but actually flipping it on its head. How do we make healthier alternatives tasty, affordable, convenient, eliminate many of the things that are currently standing in the way of most people from eating those kinds of products.
Mm-hmm. And I know that subsequent work that you've done tried to figure out more of these mechanisms. What is it about the ultra-processed foods? And I think there's a couple of things that are now thought to be mediating this effect of hyperphagia. Yeah, can you explain what those factors are?
Yeah, sure. So we've done a couple of these ad libitum feeding trials, these month-long trials of diets that were, varying in ultra-processed foods. One that was focused on that, and another which was focused on varying carbs and fat in the diet, and yet had about, I think it was around 30% of calories from ultra-processed foods. One intriguing finding was that only the ultra-processed mixed macronutrient diet led people to gain weight. All the other three diets led people to lose weight spontaneously. So again, there's something about this ultra-processed diet that seems to be driving weight gain. But when we then went back and said, okay, let's, in a post hoc sort of exploratory analysis, right? This is not pre-specified, but let's take properties of the meals themselves that we presented to folks. And let's ask the question, what was correlated with calorie intake of that actual meal? And so we looked at things like the energy density of the meal on the plate once you get rid of the beverages, the number of individual foods that are deemed hyperpalatable by this definition, where pairs of nutrients have to cross certain thresholds. So either a food that's above a certain threshold for fat and sugar, above thresholds for fat and salt, or above thresholds for salt and carbs. This was a definition that Tara Fazzino put out several years ago. We also measured how quickly people ate the meals. And we also looked at how much protein was presented to people on these different meals. And we basically just did a big, mixed statistical model that factored in these various components and asked the question, what were these things correlated with how many calories people chose to eat on those meals? And all of them were statistically significant. One in the direction that is still puzzling to me, which was that the more protein that we presented to people, the more calories they tended to eat, which is a little against the idea that protein is more satiating. But so there's some interesting results there that I'd love to follow up on. But what we found was that the quicker that somebody ate the meals, the more calories that they ate, the higher the energy density of the meals, the more calories people ate, and the more hyperpalatable foods that we presented on the plate, the more people tended to eat in calories. And when we compared the relative contribution of each of those different factors, the two that stood out as the most explanatory of the data that we had was the energy density and the number of hyperpalatable foods that we presented to people.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing was that the coefficients, the statistical coefficients that were describing the magnitude of the different effects were quite consistent across all the different diets, regardless of whether it was ultra processed or not. So those same factors were driving excess calorie consumption on the minimally processed diet or the low carb diet or the low fat diet. They were consistent across these different dietary patterns, which suggested to us that maybe they really do play a wider role, and that those properties just tend to be higher in ultra-processed foods. And that's why we would think that they are driving excess calories in that diet condition. And so we designed this follow-up study because, again, that's all secondary kind of hypothesis generating sort of analysis. And no matter how strongly you believe that those things might be underlying it, you have to design a new study to test that. And so that's what we did. And so a few years ago, we kind of designed this protocol where we would do one diet that was very similar to the original minimally processed diet, relatively low in energy density and low in hyperpalatable foods. And then we had 3 ultra-processed diets with more than 80% of calories from ultra-processed foods. One that's high in energy density, high in hyperpalatable foods, similar to the original diet. One that's high in energy density and low in hyperpalatable foods, and then another one that's low in both energy density and hyperpalatable foods. So the idea being that maybe we could disentangle the relative contribution of energy density versus hyperpalatable foods in driving excess calorie intake. And so we're excited about that. That study just wrapped up, and we're kind of in the data analysis stage now, and hopefully we'll have a preprint or something like that published soon.
So you don't know the results yet, or you can't disclose?
Oh, I do. I know the results.
Right.
At least the top line results I know, but yeah. It's all I'll say is that we did an interim analysis that was published not published, that was presented last year in London. There are small changes from what we presented when you account for the full data set, but there's no big surprise, I think, in the full data set.
Mm-hmm. Basically, these two factors, the calorie density, which is basically in the same mass of food, how many calories are contained, that to be a big factor there for this overconsumption of calories in ultra-processed foods. And the other one being this hyperpalatability, which I'm a little more uncertain on. Does that kind of overlap with the pleasantness, or is it just?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of these things in nutrition and science in general where the name doesn't necessarily reflect what's actually being, like I said, ultra-processed foods, it turns out to be more about the formulation than the actual processing when it comes to practically identifying them. And I think that when we went back and looked at the data in terms of pleasantness ratings, did the meals that had more hyperpalatable foods, were they more likely to be rated more pleasant? I think the answer was yes, but it was a pretty weak effect. So that when we averaged over all the meals in the ultra processed versus minimally processed, we didn't detect a significant difference. But again, the different meals varied quite a bit in terms of how many hyperpalatable products we put in front of people according to this definition. But again, I would say that it's even if even if those pairs of nutrients qualify it as being hyperpalatable, just because it's hyperpalatable doesn't mean that that's the mechanism by which these foods play that role. It could be this more subconscious low road of sensing of these pairs of nutrients in the gut, which stimulate different parts of the brain that are below our conscious awareness about liking and things like that, maybe more about wanting. So again, maybe it's a bit of a misnomer, but it seems to be capturing at least some physiological effect. It's one of the things in science, you try to name something the best name that you have at the time of what you think might be going on, but it might not be that might not actually reflect the true biology or physiology.
Yeah, scientists aren't the best at coming up with names. They're not great marketers. It's usually
Right.
I make fun of that in the videos. I make like all the acronyms and the weird names, and it's almost like a running joke. Did you say
But
that?
I will say that the sort of marketing around this ultra processed food, the idea, right, and as much criticism as it gets, I would say that this concept and this way of looking at foods has captured more attention
Mhm.
than all of the discussions that we've had about saturated fat or sodium or added sugars. It's really captured the public's attention and has really driven a lot of the dialogue, especially in the US that we've seen now, the UK as well, about what's wrong with our food system and what's potentially driving some of the diet-related chronic disease. And I have this argument with folks all the time who are very much still in the camp of this is too fuzzy of a definition. At the
Right.
end of the day, it's really going to be about the things that we knew about. I'm like, yeah, that might be true, but when in the past have you had this level of interest in nutrition and what's driving diet-related chronic disease? You didn't have it when you were talking about sugar. You didn't have it when you were talking about saturated fat. You didn't have it when you were looking at hypertension and sodium. Now you've got this thing that is a little bit of a mishmash of all of these different things together. And yeah, we can quibble about, the edge cases and whatnot, but it's capturing into the public's imagination in ways that are demanding action that haven't been the case in the more traditional ways of looking at food. So from that, I'll give the originators of the name a little bit of credit.
Yeah, and I think there's very little resistance from the public also that these foods might be problematic or harmful. I haven't seen, the contrarian point of view too often.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely comes up. I mean, it comes up every once in a while. I think that there's a lot of folks, they tended to be part of the low carb community who kind of come out and say, oh, well, this is really just about processed carbohydrates. And that's the real problem. And that this idea of ultra processed foods is just kind of glomming on to the problem of processed carbohydrates. I've seen that quite a bit. And who knows, maybe at the end of the day, they're right, but you still need to do the studies to demonstrate that. In our first study, the glycemic load was matched between the groups. If I looked at the CGM results, they looked like they overlapped between the meals that were ultra processed versus minimally processed. It didn't seem to have a lot of a lot to do with it, whether or not there was carbs or not as driving this effect. Clearly, if you made ultra processed low carb diets, maybe we'd see a very different sort of result, but that's not the study that we looked at, and we didn't see differences when we matched for carbs and sugar.
When you were explaining the results, did I understand correctly? You said that only the ultra processed foods that had a mix of macronutrients induced overeating, and then when they
No, I was saying that we've done two ad libitum feeding trials. Two of them had two of the diets that were used in one of them had a relatively low proportion of ultra processed foods, but they varied widely. One of them was very low in fat and high in carbs, starchy carbs. The other one was very low in carbs and high in animal fat and saturated fat. And the question was, did either of those diets with about 30% of overall calories from ultra processed food lead people to overeat and gain weight? And the answer was no. They lost weight, lost body fat in both groups. The only time we've seen people gain weight and gain body fat was with a mixed macronutrient, highly ultra processed diet. We have never tested a low fat, high carb, ultra processed diet or a low carb, high fat, ultra processed diet. That's never been done before.
Mhm. I mean, it'll be really surprising to me, at least, if low carb junk or low fat junk, if one of them just happens to be this magic healthy food. I mean, I'd be blown away. But hey, I agree that
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think to be fair, I mean, I think we've seen the low fat version of that, right? That was the people, the food industry glomming onto the low fat, even though it was really supposed to be low saturated fat. They said, oh, well, low fat in general, that'll get us the low saturated fat too. And we'll just add all the sugar and sweeteners and things like that. So we've already seen that that's not successful, right? I guess one of the questions is all the ultra processed keto products that are now on the market, is that
right.
equally problematic, or is it more of a wash? I don't know.
On this note of the fat and the carb, this is another big chapter in your career or in your publications that made a massive splash on social media and also the mainstream media. This whole debate between what causes weight gain. Is it the carbs? Is it the calories?
Yeah.
Do you want to go over that and kind of summarize that chapter?
Yeah, sure, as quickly as I can. Yeah, I mean, again, I was just really interested in this idea of, how does the body adapt to different fuels, especially when you change carbs and fat? What's going on inside the body? How are the hormones changing? How are the different organs communicating with each other? And is it really true that when it comes to carbs versus fat, that a calorie is more or less a calorie? And there's this long history of these really incredible studies that were done in the late 19th century with feeding dogs like highly processed carbs versus oils, and trying to kind of figure out which nutrients slowed fat loss the most. And that was the discovery that, well, it turned out that the grams that you fed the dog didn't matter. It was the calories that you fed the dog, and it was independent of carbs versus fat. And I was developing these computer simulation models of what's going on inside the body, and at this point, this was like 2003, 2004 or so, low carb diets were on the ascendance again, and people were starting to talk about the so-called metabolic advantage of low carb diets, and that maybe you could even eat more calories on a low carb diet and still lose body fat. And that went against the calories a calorie idea. And it turned out, when I did some simulations in our models, it seemed like it was close to a calories a calorie when you matched for how many calories people were eating, but it wasn't exactly. And we were able to show that, and it was a common, again, this common criticism of most of the studies that had been done in the past. And I think Gary Tubbs made this point quite well in his book, Why We Get Fat. He said, even people who go on a low fat diet, they often also cut carbs compared to where they were at the start. And so how do you know that they're losing fat if they're successful on this low fat diet? Because of the fat that they cut in their diet, the calories they cut in the diet, or the carbs that they cut in the diet? And he had a very strong point of view that it's really the carbs that are driving excess insulin, which are kind of trapping fat in fat cells, and that's causing the feelings of hunger and maybe even suppressing energy expenditure. And so I thought that was an interesting criticism. And it kind of matched with the study that we'd already started to run, which was, what happens if you just cut carbs from people's diet, keeping fat and protein at sort of the eucaloric baseline levels, or you just cut fat from somebody's diet, keeping carbs and protein at baseline levels. Now you can actually have that comparison when you're not cutting all macronutrients or even two macronutrients. You're cutting one at a time, and you can compare the same people in these two diets. And the model suggested, interestingly, that a lot of the predictions, again, of the mechanisms that the low carb folks were talking about were true, where, you cut carbs in people's diets, insulin secretion goes down, you release more fat from fat cells because lipolysis is not as restrained, fatty acids go up in the blood, you start burning more fat. And so even though you haven't cut any fat in the diet, you're burning more fat, so you've got to lose body fat to kind of make up for the difference. And that all was predicted by our model. What I thought was a surprising prediction of our model was that when you cut fat in people's diet, the model predicted that you didn't adapt by burning less fat. So in the case that I just talked about, where you cut carbs, you actually end up burning more fat and less carbs to adapt to the nutrient composition of the diet. The model suggested that doesn't happen when you cut fat in the diet. You keep burning the same amount of fat. And so when you then look to see what the fat imbalance is, you're cutting fat and coming into the body, you're burning the same amount, you also have to lose body fat. And the model predicted you would lose a little bit more body fat in that case than the restricted carbs case, even though you cut the same number of calories from people's diets. So it was a bit of a surprising prediction. I kind of expected the model would be wrong, and that was part of the purpose of doing the experiment, was to show, what would be the mechanism by which the body would sense a cut in dietary fat and shift its fuel selection in a way to adapt to that. Because the model is based on overfeeding studies where if you just overfeed fat, nothing happens to how much fat the body burns. But if you overfeed carbs, it does a similar sort of stand on its head to burn more carbs, suppress fat oxidation sort of thing. And so I thought maybe that's just a artifact of overfeeding is not a normal evolutionary adaptation, but underfeeding certainly is, and maybe we would be more responsive to the underfeeding fat. And the model was right. And it turned out that a calorie wasn't exactly a calorie, but was a practically meaningless difference, like tens of grams per day difference in the rate of fat loss. But it suggested that if low carb diets were working, it wasn't because of some magic metabolic advantage to preferentially lose body fat. And of course we're accounting for how many calories people were burning, because we were making all these measurements in these metabolic chambers at the NIH Clinical Center to measure every gram of fat that was being burned, as well as the total number of calories. And it turned out that only in the reduced carb case were people's calorie expenditure going down significantly. The same people burned more calories. They didn't have a metabolic advantage. They seemed to have a meaningless metabolic disadvantage. So it didn't seem, our interpretation was that we could devise this really interesting physiological experiment to demonstrate that, yeah, a calorie is a calorie isn't quite right. That we can actually detect significant differences when it comes to a statistical significant sense. And it also means that the way that people's low carb diets are working isn't probably due to the reasons that are being marketed. It's probably something else to do with appetite, maybe. But our result doesn't mean that people should go on a low fat diet, even though some folks in the low fat diet camp said, oh, hey, this is great news, and come give a talk at our workshop. And it's like, that wasn't the message we were going for. It was just a silly sort of physiological study. But then, the diet wars get pretty heated. And so there's a big low carb segment that took a lot of issue with our study and said, it's too short to be meaningful, and you didn't really go low carb enough. And we didn't really say that this was going to happen immediately. It takes, days and weeks for this sort of to develop. And so we did other studies, and to make a long story short, we kind of repeatedly failed to see a meaningful effect that matched the way that the sort of model that was prevalent at the time for how carbs play a unique role in making people fat, and what to do about it in terms of the low carb diets and how they affect the body. I mean, we clearly see many of the physiological changes that have been expected for a very long time. And they might have really interesting effects on things like the immune system, which was something that we studied with very low carb diets. But the idea that they allow people to eat more calories and that they can lose body fat eating more calories than they did before, when you actually measure calorie expenditure using metabolic chambers, we don't see that. I mean, we see, depending on when you look and exactly the time frame, and maybe 100 calories a day at the most when it's most beneficial. In other cases, it's less beneficial. So really, really small effects.
My impression, how I organized this, was that your trial and then Christopher Gardner's trial, Diet Fits, were complementary. They both tested a similar idea, and yours had much more experimental control, but it was shorter necessarily. And then Christopher's was a free living trial, but lasted, I think it was a year. And the results were, the bottom line was similar, that you cut fat or you cut carbs from your diet. Either way, you can lose fat mass. which to me is good news. I always think that this is good.
Yeah, yeah.
Multiple ways to get to your result. I don't understand why people are upset when their way works and someone else's way also works.
Right, right. Well, I think again, it comes down to the fact that, the way they've been able to make sense of their particular group of having that degree of success and the, honest reports of, acolytes of the diet saying, yeah, I was never hungry. It was like magic. I was eating more calories. They try to make sense of these anecdotes in a way that has some sort of biological plausibility. And because you have that biological plausibility, you can then go forth and motivate people. It was interesting when I finished that first study, and then we did another repeat study that was happening at the same time as Christopher Gardner's study that, again, had a very small effect size. But while that study was ongoing and I completed the first one, I remember Gary Taubes had said, there's this guy in a cardiologist in Virginia. You've got to meet him. He's kind of a low carb guy. He's had a lot of success with his patients. It'd be great if you could host him at the NIH. And so he came up and I kind of went through the data with him, suggesting, maybe it's not working the way that, the usual model that people are promoting is saying that these diets are working. Doesn't mean they don't work. It's just maybe not this mechanism. He said, yeah, I can see that. But, when I can tell a patient the reason why they failed in the past, because they haven't targeted this right mechanism. It's only now that we understand this mechanism that it's unlocking the secret to being able to do this. This really motivates my patients. And so, yeah, maybe it's not completely true, but as from a practical standpoint, I find that telling that story is a lot more motivational to people. And I'm like, yeah, I can't argue with that. It's like, that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. I mean, especially when you don't think you're lying to them, right? If you actually have bought into this yourself and you see the success that people who are on these diets, not to mention the fact that the people who weren't successful probably leave and go to another practice. But yeah, I mean, I think that's where the difference is between doing the science and treating actual patients is a difference, right? I don't treat patients, right? I don't have that responsibility. I don't have the responsibility of motivating them to stick to a diet or stick to a certain lifestyle. And I can step back and just say, what happens when you do this manipulation to diet? What are the main outcomes that I'm interested in? And pre-specify those and report those accurately. And people can argue about it all they want, but that's how the study was designed. That's how it was reported.
Yeah. The data is the data. From my point of view, having a lot of feedback from viewers, I mean, one thing I see that is clear is this enormous diversity. Some people say, I tried everything and only a low carb diet. I mean, it was like it was magic. I suddenly could, not overeat and I was losing weight. I think that's great. But other people tell the exact opposite story. I tried the low carb diet and I failed completely. I gained weight on the low carb, but then I went low fat, or other people tried both, neither worked, but then something else worked. And I think I know that for a lot of people, none of these solutions are working, because a lot of people who are struggling with their weight, they've tried the low carb and the low fat and all these popular.
The idea that people who are, have obesity and that they just haven't tried the magic diet it's absurd to me. But and in fact, Christopher Gardner's study was designed to try to test the hypothesis that there is a subgroup of people who's most responsive to a low carb diet and another group that's more responsive to a low fat diet. That was based on this sort of the kind of thing that we were talking about before. You go back to your previous study and you kind of dig around to try to generate some hypotheses of what were the best predictors of the folks who lost the most weight on one diet versus another. And then you design a new study prospectively. And so not only was it that he found that on average, both diets gave more or less the same amount of weight and body fat loss, but he found that the predictors, the post hoc predictors of his previous study were no longer predictors in the new study. And one of those things was, how much insulin was secreted after like a oral glucose tolerance test or something like that. And whereas that seemed to like be correlative in when you dig around in the data from the previous study, when you design a study based on that, turned out, that wasn't predictive in the future one, because that's one of the things that scientists can be easily fooled, because if they keep analyzing the data it's like you're torturing it in some sense, right? Until you get the answer that kind of makes sense in your head, and it's like, aha. And what you don't keep careful track of, because none of that was pre-specified, you actually went through 20 different iterations of the data analysis to kind of come up with that new hypothesis. And every step along the way, you probably have a perfectly good rationale for, yeah, it makes more sense to analyze it this way rather than that way, or maybe these outliers, or where, I should ignore them because it's not physiological, or whatever it is. But I think a lot of people kind of don't realize that when you're doing the sort of post hoc data analysis, that this sort of thing goes on all the time. And even in post hoc data analysis, what you should do is pre-specify what you're going to do in advance, right? Before you start digging in. And there's no registry for that as far as I know. And we're as guilty of it as anyone else. We just want to go in, like we're like kids in a candy store. We just want to figure out what happened, like let's explore this as much as possible. And that's why we have to be really careful and say, this is all exploratory, right? We tried lots of stuff. And this is the thing that sort of made sense and made like an interesting story that we now need to go test in a new study.
Yeah, I think it's almost undeniable that different people do well on different diets. I mean, I see that so consistently. But it sounds like, from what I know, we don't yet understand exactly why. One person will do really well on low carb, and the neighbor will do really well on low fat, and the other neighbor will do really well on the third diet that is low nothing.
Right. I think what people discount is the possibility it has nothing to do with the diet itself, but the time in people's lives and whether or not they have a supportive partner, a stable job. They have the wherewithal and the interest to basically prepare their foods themselves. They can plan for those things. It was interesting. My co-author, Julia Belluz, she actually did a story for Vox on Christopher's study. And she asked, can I speak to some of these people that were either successful or unsuccessful? And it's not a representative sample, but the one thing that she found that was pretty common among the folks who were unsuccessful were like these social or disruptions in their lives. They were not in a stable part of their relationship, or they lost their job or got a divorce or something like that. Whereas the more successful folks tended to have more stable social environments. And so I think we often discount that, and we're looking for some biological magic bullet, when a lot of the variability is just the ability to kind of, focus on yourself a little bit and put your health as having a higher priority than many of these other competing factors in your life. And that is not as well studied as it should be, in my view.
Yeah, 100%. All the aspects that go on in our lives outside of the food itself, which are huge. If we can wrap up with a little bit, I want to get your take on this whole zeitgeist, and you have this direct experience with the agencies right now in the U.S. and RFK Jr. This is like a hot topic, and you had direct, very, very direct experience with that. For people at home who don't know, there was a whole situation where you felt your work was being censored, or your communication of your results was being censored or controlled or limited, and you ended up resigning from your position of a tenure track position, of a tenured position at the NIH. Which, I mean, the integrity and the guts to do that, it's hard to fathom. But yeah, can you go a little bit into what happened, and what do you think is going to happen with this whole situation?
Yeah, I wish I could predict the future, and I can't, but I can tell you what I experienced. It gets at this question of, the idea we talked about before of the concept of ultra-processed foods, and the concept that it's by some mechanism they might be driving a lot of the diet-related chronic disease increase that we've seen in the U.S. and around the world. And the idea that the public and even politicians had sort of latched onto this idea as something really important was actually pretty exciting during the run-up to the last presidential election, because there were Senate hearings where Bernie Sanders and Cory Booker, famous U.S. Democratic senators, you really couldn't tell what they were saying that was any different than what RFK Jr. was saying when it came to ultra-processed foods and the role that they might be playing in damaging our health. And again, I think I also mentioned that, in the past, we'd seen sort of defunding of the kinds of clinical research centers that were needed to really kind of expand on this research. And we actually had plans about how could we actually have the sort of facilities that would allow us to get answers to these questions much more quickly. And so I've been working with folks at the NIH, the Office of Nutrition Research, their director, as well as folks in the diabetes, obesity, and endocrinology branch at my institute at NIH to kind of say, look, no matter who wins, it seems like there's finally some political momentum that was generated by this group of sort of grassroots, make America healthy again sort of movement that's finally like reaching a crescendo at a level that I had certainly not experienced in the 20 previous years that I've been at the NIH. And so we should be in a position where we want to actually do something about it. And so we were really planning to kind of take advantage of this and really improve the quality of human nutrition research and give not just our research group, but researchers around the country, try to give them access to the kind of facilities to do the best science in this area. So we were really excited. And I thought there's obviously a lot of discussion that was a little disheartening around vaccines and COVID, which I was pretty leery about after, the election turned out the way that it did, and after RFK Jr. was nominated and eventually confirmed. But, I thought, that's not my area. I'm not going to fight that battle. I'm interested in ultra-processed foods, how they might be damaging our health, whether or not they're addictive or not, what the mechanisms of addiction might be in these kinds of foods. And, we had ongoing studies addressing this. And I reached out even before the election to various members in the political leadership of MAHA to say, look, no matter what way this goes, I'd be really interested in telling you about our research and what we've been doing. And I just really didn't hear any response at all. Occasionally I would get like a DM on X saying, oh yeah, great, here, send me an email at this address and we'll set up a time. And I would do that and never hear back, and recontact and never hear back. But at the same time, there's these roundtable discussions with social media influencers being talked about, and they're meeting with all these folks. And it's like, this is a little weird. They're talking to social media influencers. They're not talking to any scientists, as far as I can tell, that are actually doing work in this space. But maybe that'll change after the election. At the beginning of the transition period, there was this really awkward sort of pause. We were not allowed to communicate outside the NIH. So we weren't allowed to go to conferences. We weren't allowed to give talks. And to be fair, that happened during the Obama, the transition as well, but it was only a few days, and this kind of lasted for weeks. And eventually it became clear that it was going to lift, but there was a list of topics that the administration was particularly interested in controlling the narrative around. And one of those was ultra-processed foods. The other was nutrition. There were other aspects of health equity, obviously all the DEI stuff that people had targeted. If you were doing any research in those types of areas, whereas traditionally you would get approval at the NIH level, it had to be approved by a political appointee at the HHS level. And so in this time period, several of my colleagues were now able to, if they couldn't travel to give talks, they could actually do talks remotely. And I had the opportunity to, an invitation by Bloomberg Philanthropies. They had their annual food meeting, and they asked me to come and talk about ultra-processed foods. And, it'd always been the process. You have to request permission at the NIH to do this. And in 20 years of doing this, it had always been a rubber stamp, right? Of course, you talk about your science at conferences and in places where people want to do this. And it was denied with no explanation. And I thought, well, maybe it's because the travel stuff, and is that the reason? So I made clear, it's like, no, they said it was okay if I just do this virtually. And it was, again, denied. There's no reason given. So that was really strange. And I thought, okay, there's clearly a level of oversight around these topics that and political sort of influence around communication in these topics that I haven't experienced in the past. Then I mentioned the American Heart Association Scientific Advisory on Ultra-Processed Food that I've been working for a little more than a year on at that point. And I wrote this section on, potential mechanisms. A colleague of mine written a section on health equity issues about how these kinds of foods are typically targeted to lower SES folks and communities. And And so again, one of the kind of normal processes at the NIH is that when the manuscript is ready to be submitted, you submit it for clearance by your institute. And in fact, our institute said, yeah, you're good to go. And I communicated back to the other authors, like, okay, yeah, we can submit it now. And then the next day I was told, yeah, actually, no, it's not good to go anymore, because it turns out that there's a section in your paper about health equity, and that goes against the executive order that was passed by the President Trump. And so you're going to have that part, modified in some way to meet the current executive orders, or you're going to have to remove yourself as an author. And I'm like, I'm not going to censor my colleague, right? What she's written should stand, and I don't want the fact that this topic has become a political talking point to be an issue on the scientific communication from the American Heart Association. So I withdrew myself as an author. But again, clearly something about various topics were being controlled at a political level. And then we had a paper that was scheduled to be published, and I'd been working with our press office for weeks about a press release on this paper, because we thought that there could be some confusion about it, and we wanted to make sure the public kind of got the right messaging on it. And it was a study where we were looking at brain responses, in particular the neurotransmitter dopamine after consuming ultra-processed foods high in fat and sugar, because a lot of the discussion about ultra-processed foods is that maybe they're addictive in the same way that drugs like cocaine or even nicotine are addictive. And one of the things that our colleagues in the Addiction Institutes and people funded by that institute have kind of come up with over the years is that many of these highly addictive drugs give rise to, when they're consumed, a very large increase in dopamine in brain reward regions, kind of hijacking them. And so we designed a big study to test this idea, a couple of different ideas. There's two primary aims of the study. And what we found, kind of surprisingly, was that we didn't see any measurable increase on average of dopamine in the brain. And it just suggested to us not that these foods aren't addictive for some people, because they may very well be, but this mechanism doesn't seem to be in common, at least to the magnitude that is seen with these stimulant drugs of abuse. And so we wanted to be careful with the messaging on that. So we wrote this press release, and the press release was like, yeah, no press release for this paper. And so we went back and said, okay, well, what about a media advisory, a little shorter statement with no quotes so that they can't kind of get quotes on it? And that was also killed by HHS. And like, this is really weird. Again, not a huge deal, but it's like something different is going on. And then the journal, because it was part of the special issue on obesity, they list all the papers that are coming out. That gets like a little bit of a press push to say, here's what's coming up in this issue. And a journalist from the New York Times contacted me and said, hey, I'm really interested in writing about the study that you did. Can you talk with me about it? And again, the normal process is, okay, we submit our media request to our press office at our institute. It usually gets approved at that level. But again, ultra-processed foods goes up to HHS. And it's like, nope, no interview. And the reporter then told me that the HHS communications director called her and said, is this really a story about RFK Jr.? Because the results of this paper don't match his thoughts on ultra-processed foods. And she told me about this. And I'm like, what is going on here? So the reason that they don't want you to talk to me and report about this paper is because it goes against some sort of preconceived narrative about how ultra-processed foods work. And yeah, you can go back and you can see snippets of RFK Jr. talking about sugar as crack or something like this, that it's as addictive as these substances. And yet we weren't even saying that these foods weren't addictive for some people. We were just saying that it doesn't share this particular biological mechanism with, highly addictive stimulant drugs. But even that seemed to be too much for them to kind of stomach as a difference in that science complicating the story a little bit. And so what the HHS communications director did after he kind of realized that there was actual genuine interest in this reporter writing about the study, said, okay, well, submit the written questions and we'll prepare answers. So I worked with my co-author and folks in the Addiction Institute to prepare like written answers to those questions, submitted them to our press office. And then the next morning I was CC'd on the response to the reporter, and the answers to our questions had been edited in a way to kind of downplay the study, saying it was a really small study, that we only controlled people's diets for like 5 days before the test, and we only looked at one kind of ultra processed food, and it was like there was no, and it was submitted as if I'd written those responses. And so of course I'm talking with the reporter saying, look, these have been edited. Like I'm just flabbergasted that they would go this far to control the messaging on a study that has already been done. It's already going to be published, and they're trying to downplay it because, as they already admitted, it was going against the narrative that RFK Jr. was talking about with respect to these foods. And so at this point, I'm like, what's going to happen with the next study? I've got this other study coming out, and at that point I'd already said that we had these interim results where we designed a diet very high in ultra processed foods that didn't cause overeating, right, and cause people to lose a little bit of weight by targeting these mechanisms. Are they going to like prevent us from reporting this, or how are they going to manage this? We haven't even written the paper yet. Are they going to want to do what they did in the first the AHA statement, saying, no, you can't submit this paper until you edit it in the way that we like it? Like, that's unacceptable. What about the next study we design? Are they going to want to influence the design of the study? And so I was really concerned. And so I basically wrote to RFK Jr., several of his deputies. I wrote to the NIH director, several other folks in the NIH director's office saying, look, here's my concern. This is what I've experienced. We are doing like some of the world's leading work in this area, which is supposed to be a priority of this administration. In fact, we have been working on plans to kind of expand the capabilities of nutrition research for many people around the country. I attached like the plans that we've been producing and saying, look, I'd really like the chance to talk with you because, things are looking pretty bleak right now, both from a funding perspective, as well as from the perspective of, at that point we were having troubles even buying food for our study subjects. There was such kind of turmoil at the NIH that, in fact, ever since I think it was April, we ran out of CGMs, and we haven't been able to purchase CGMs ever since because of people being fired from the purchasing departments and all of this chaos that's going on. And I talked to my scientific leadership intramurally, and they said, yeah, I don't see this getting any better anytime soon. In fact, we're not going to be able to hire any people. The study staff that are leaving as part of the normal rotation are these undergraduates who come in. We, at that time, weren't able to rehire them. So a lot of the legwork to run these studies was going to disappear. And so I was really concerned about our ability to do this research in the future. And I thought, going in maybe naively, that because this was such a priority for this administration, despite maybe disagreements that we have on other aspects, that we would actually be able to still advance this area of science. And so I wrote this email saying, I'd really like the chance to discuss the opportunities as well as what I think are non-negotiable interference with the communication and operation of science that I've even experienced in this short time period. And at that point, we had, I think, 3 weeks until there was a deadline to apply for voluntary early retirement. They lowered the retirement age. And, I'm Canadian, and normally this wouldn't be a big deal, but one of the advantages of being a federal employee who retires through this mechanism is you get to keep your family's health insurance afterwards, whereas health insurance is an incredibly expensive benefit, and it's tied to employment. And so I would feel a huge amount of pressure to accept, almost any other job if I was to quit and protest after this, not retiring, right? So I basically said, look, this is the deadline. I'd really love to meet with you and talk about the opportunities, about what I've been experiencing so far. And I heard nothing. And basically, what I did hear was from somebody who I did not write the email to, wrote to me and said, "Oh, I saw your letter." I'm like, You weren't CC'd on this. So it's like, no, the NIH director's office circulated it amongst various folks at the NIH. So someone clearly saw it and circulated it, but they didn't actually respond to me. Um, and so I began the process of basically closing up the lab, kind of finding out where my staff could go and be reassigned to other units, and the protocols that were still running, which PIs could take those over, and yeah, I didn't hear anything back. And then basically on the last day that was possible, I gave my voluntary retirement through that process, and left the NIH. And yeah, it was a really hard day because up until that point, we've obviously had struggles here and there, but as far as jobs go, there's struggles everywhere, and this was pretty much the ideal place where I had kind of the maximum amount of freedom and tenure to do, what I thought was the most important science. And yeah, I kind of had to leave because I wasn't willing to put up with what I thought was the very likely interference that I'd already experienced, having that exacerbated and then be faced with the option of, oh, I can just quit and lose my family's health insurance. I thought this was the only sensible choice.
Yeah, like I said, I think it takes incredible integrity to walk away from a dream job because of the way that top down there's interference with the communication of the science, and it's tragic, and it's not an isolated incident. I've seen other examples of this. The folks in the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, there's a similar story. They were trying to submit an abstract to a conference to talk about the things that the information they put together, and that got blocked also by the higher ups.
Which is crazy, right? Because they already issued their report, right? So it's like, what are they blocking?
Right.
So,
yeah, I guess it's a dissemination of the ideas more, but
yeah,
on one hand, it's weird because then there's the Streisand effect where you try to block something, it becomes even more popular,
right.
because people talk about, oh, this is trying to be stifled. And this is the irony also, is these folks are the same crew that previously, when they were the anti-establishment, complained, high and low, that they were being censored and their views were not being listened to, and with good arguments, because there was a lot of censorship during COVID, and a lot of these people were, at least but by social media companies, were locked out and banned. So I thought it was a very good case, and I thought I was against them being banned from social media and kind of their voices being silenced. I think basically freedom of speech. We should be able to say things, even if they're dumb, even if we're wrong, we should be able to say it.
Yep.
But the irony is that as soon as they're in power, they turn around and apply the censorship to the dissenting views.
Right. And I mean, and to be fair, one of the folks who claims to have experienced that was Jay Bhattacharya, who became the NIH director, and he only became NIH director right around the time that I had retired. So like there was, I think, a week or two, I think it was more like a week, when there was overlap between the acting director and him. And so when I retired and it got a little bit of press attention, he actually DM'd me on X saying he wanted to talk about it, saying no one should be censored at NIH. And so I went and met with him the next day, and it was clear he could have talked about the censorship issue the whole time, but I don't think I think he still to this day says, oh, this is just the usual sort of Biden era kind of problem with having like your manuscripts having to go through this process. And I was there with the deputy director of intramural research, and we were both kind of saying, no, this was very clearly HHS kind of interfering in the usual process. That's never been a problem. But I actually then in that meeting sort of tried to shift gears and say, well, look, there's so much kind of destruction at this point going on. Like that was the day I think that the leak had come out about the proposed budget cut to the NIH and the reorganization of the different institutes and how much chaos that would occur. And I said, a lot of people are losing hope that any real science is going to get done in this process. And I've been working with my colleagues to try to say, how are we going to improve nutrition science in this way? And he clearly looked at the at the document I prepared, including like the transition plan, which involved getting more beds at the clinical center to transition to like a separate facility for other folks to be able to do this kind of research. And he said, I'd really like to work on this with you. And he shook my hand and said, welcome back. And I'm like, well, I don't have anything to come back to. My lab is gone, but if you're really serious about working on developing this, I'd be thrilled to kind of work on it. And so I sort of stopped doing interviews and stopped talking to the press for weeks as I sort of worked with the deputy director for intramural research to say, what would this look like? What office through the NIH would this operate through? Where would we get the funding to do this? And I was working with them, and again, the director of the Office of Nutrition Research at the NIH to work on this. And so for several weeks, I thought I was going to go back and lead this new effort. And in fact, I triple checked before I left the NIH, is it possible for me to ever come back and work full time? And it was like, yeah, it's not a problem. And my institute was willing to kind of have me come back and do this in my capacity. And so we were working on this and really excited. And then I got the call. I was actually giving a talk in Canada, and the director of the Office of Nutrition Research called me and said, I don't know what happened, but I was just told by the acting director of the office that would be running this new center that it's just not going to happen. And she wouldn't give any reason for it. It wasn't clear, what the rationale was. It just seemed to come out of nowhere after a lot of internal enthusiasm at the NIH. And it was really shocking. And the deputy director kind of basically gave me the same message. It was a Friday. I got the same message from her on a Monday. Like, yeah, I'm not optimistic that we could do anything like this at the NIH at this point. And it just kind of seemed to me that the level of independence that the NIH used to have under previous leaderships is no longer there. I think that it's much more subservient to the HHS political leadership. And so even given subsequently this opportunity to be like, okay, you want to do something about ultra processed foods and understanding and do the gold standard science you keep talking about, we prepared the path forward for this, and they're just not interested. And the message to me is that science gets in the way of a good narrative, right? If you already think you know the answer and you have your little pet model about how it works and you therefore know what to do about it, the only thing that science can do is throw complexity and nuance and complications into that narrative. And I fear that this administration really isn't interested in doing that science. They're really interested in only looking at the data that support their worldview in the same way that a trial lawyer is going to emphasize things that support their case and downplay things that don't support their case. They downplayed the evidence that ultra-processed foods don't give rise to the same dopamine response in the brain, not because they have such objections to that science. It's just that doesn't contribute to their story. And so let's downplay that as much as possible. But like you said, I think the Streisand effect is kind of at work here, right? Every time you give them the opportunity to do something substantive and advance the science, they keep turning away from it and saying, oh, you guys were part of the problem. We just got to get rid of this establishment group that presided over, so much diet-related chronic disease, and as if we had the power to institute policies to change it. It's not our job as scientists to do that.
Yeah, unfortunately, this reflects what I've seen from RFK's communication and the policies that I've seen from the whole MAGA movement. Is a lot of times their views are kind of divorced from science and trying to cover the science or trying to dialogue. There's just no interest. It's almost like we have this view and the data is an inconvenience, whether it's the seed oils or the tallow or all these ideas that
Right.
It's almost like the science is not a part of the picture. It's almost like this nagging thing on the side.
It is, and yet the rhetoric is often saying that we want to do the gold standard science, and it's been problematic in the past, and science has been censored, and we want to do the best science to do these things, or we want to institute the right policies, and But practically speaking, we've seen exactly the opposite, right? We haven't seen investment or even proposals for investment in this kind of research. We haven't seen, even at the policy end, meaningful proposals that are going to make a real difference. In fact, we've seen cuts to the very programs that provide fresh fruits and vegetables to school kids from local farms. We've seen cuts to SNAP education that's supposed to make it provide people with the kind of education to prepare more fresh meals from scratch. So exactly the opposite actions to the rhetoric. It's like you've got to watch what they do, not what they say. And I think that's eventually people are going to catch on to this. And I think that, to be fair, I think even folks in the Make America Healthy Again movement, the grassroots movement, are beginning to catch on to this. Some of them are furious about rollbacks at the EPA on the kind of pesticide use that can be used in agriculture and some of the pollutants that can then be introduced to the environment. They're not impressed by some of the voluntary actions to remove food dyes and things that they recognize. The most optimistic sense are the low-hanging fruit that's going to be easy. The most pessimistic sense is this is just the talking point that we should be happy with, while nothing is it really actually done to improve the nation's dietary patterns.
Yeah, I do hope they have a positive impact, because at the end of the day, of course, it's the public that's going to suffer the consequences of all this, and we all.
Absolutely.
But I think we know from history and from common sense that trying to institute public policy and health policies in the opposite direction of science is not a great idea, to say the least.
Exactly. We've been down this path before, right? When it came to, oh, well, and the idea that you have to compare it to something, right? Like the idea that, oh, well, if saturated fat is bad, then trans fat must be okay. So let's just swap out those things. It's like, oh, wait a second, we always have to compare it and with what the replacement is. Do we really know that the natural food dyes that are derived from plants that are now being poisoned at a greater rate because of EPA rollbacks are going to be healthier for us than the synthetic food dyes that don't come along with many of those contaminants? I don't think we know that. So good intentions, maybe, sometimes not so good intentions, but talking points and claiming wins that aren't really wins is, that's my fear, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know exactly how this is going to end, but clearly talking about it, telling people what's going on, because people have the right to know. This is their tax money, making all these, funding all this. So I think exposing this and sunlight is the best disinfectant. So people knowing exactly what's going on is crucial for hopefully influencing things going in a better direction.